SoundCartel.
In this episode, we're going to answer your questions. The top 10 questions we get asked about the podcast production process.
Okay, Nick, we're getting close to the end. Question 9. What ROI can a brand expect from their podcast?
Well, I like to flip that question back a different way. What's the opportunity cost of not having an audio strategy or a podcast?
Ooh.
From SoundCartel, I'm Nick Schildberger, and this is Podcasting Essentials. Welcome to episode 12 of season 4. And to help me answer these important podcasting questions, I'm joined by producer and co-host Nicole Goodman.
Hey, Nick, happy to be back with you once again.
And Nicole, you are very well qualified to help answer these questions because you would have asked many of them yourself when you set out to produce your own podcast a few years ago. That was before you joined the team here at SoundCartel. And, because you probably won't say it yourself, an Australian podcast award-winning podcast, no less.
Oh, stop it. No. It's true, Nick. Back in the day when I was researching equipment and how to start a podcast, it was actually quite overwhelming because there is so much information out there that it actually stopped me from pursuing what I now love very much. So I asked a lot of the same questions that we're getting now as we produce podcasts for brands and individuals.
And now you're answering them.
And now I'm answering them. Who would have thought?
But before we get to answering these 10 questions, I actually want to pose 2 questions because these are questions that we ask our clients and prospects before we start producing a podcast. And they're really critical questions. They are, what is the purpose of your podcast and who is the audience for the podcast?
Look, 2 critical questions to ask before you even consider producing a podcast. It really comes down to the why. Why are you producing this podcast? What is the reason for its being? It can't just be because it's fun or you've heard it's good or everyone else is doing it. There really has to be a goal, a measurable goal. And your audience, there has to be someone in mind that you're talking to, that you're trying to convince, that you're trying to entertain. So these things need to be very clear in your mind before you dive in.
Yeah, with the purpose, we like to distill it down to an elevator pitch, 1 or 2 sentences that describes exactly why you're doing the podcast, its goals, its objectives, and then beyond that, having understanding right from the start what success looks like, what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
And if you know that and who your audience is, their habits, how they digest other types of content, then you can start to work out all the other things that go into making a podcast, the tone, the voice, the style, the content, the duration, the frequency. And they're all the questions that we're going to try and address now.
Exactly.
Okay then, let's start the 10 questions that we get asked all the time. I'm going to throw to you, Nicole, to ask the questions, but we'll both sort of answer them.
Okay, here we go. Question 1. How long should a podcast be?
That is probably the question we get asked the most.
So many times.
And it has a pretty simple answer. It should only be as long as it needs to be.
It's true.
And that means don't go on for 2 hours if you can do it in an hour. And if you have a half-hour podcast that's a bit boring in parts, then chop it back.
Editing is your friend.
Edit once, edit twice, and then edit 3 times. And when you think no more editing can be done, get someone else to listen because they'll probably find something that can be chopped out. But as far as the duration, where is the sweet spot? It really does depend, again, on who your audience is and what kind of content you're producing. But there are some stats that we point people to. One is that if it's around 20 minutes, it's most likely to be listened to in one session. I think that's really important because you don't want to give listeners a reason to not come back to your podcast. So a lot of the podcasts we produce for clients are in that sort of 15 to 20, maybe 25 minutes. There's stats around the average commute time. Not that we're commuting much at the moment, but when we're allowed to commute is about half an hour. So again, trying to keep it under that half an hour. The stats are showing that over the last couple of years, podcasts in general are getting shorter. I think that's for a couple of reasons. As news podcasts and daily podcasts are increasing in popularity and they're generally shorter. But also because people are editing more, they are chopping things back. They're not just pressing record and rambling. So I think keeping it as short as possible, respecting the listener in that case, but there are opportunities to produce longer content where it's appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, look at someone like Joe Rogan, #1 podcast in the world. I mean, his episodes are around 2-3 hours each. So there is a space for longer form podcasting, absolutely. But again, it comes down to knowing who your audience is and what they're going to be attracted to. If you know your audience wants short, sharp content, don't give them 2 hours worth of content. Give them what they're looking for. At the same time, if you're very niche and you know that only a small proportion of people are going to find what you're doing interesting, but they're all going to listen, make it 2 hours, however long it's going to take to do it. Again, comes back to understanding your audience. Now, question 2. How often should podcast episodes be released?
There's a few things around releasing podcasts. Before I get to how often, something that's really important is consistency. So if you choose weekly, then you must try and do it every week. Don't do it for 3 weeks and then go, oh, we haven't got time this week and we'll skip a week. And then because listeners become used to that regularity. So if it's going to be there every Wednesday at 7 o'clock in the morning, then release it every Wednesday at 7 o'clock. As far as how often, I think the more often you do it, the better chance you are of building an audience faster. So if you can do it weekly, you're probably going to build an audience faster than doing it fortnightly. And likewise, monthly will not be as effective as fortnightly. However, you've got to be able to maintain the production schedule and you've got to have the budget and the resources to maintain a podcast for whatever frequency you choose.
And the energy.
That's right. So you still want to do it really well because above all, it has to be entertaining. And if you can't do an entertaining podcast every week, then do it fortnightly. And if you can't do it fortnightly, then do it monthly. The only issue I have with monthly, and we saw it ourselves with our own podcast, this podcast in fact, we did our first season fortnightly and we grew an audience. Then we moved in our second season to monthly because we just changed it up a little bit. We thought we'd do case studies and that monthly would suit better. The audience plateaued. And then in season 3 and 4, we've gone back to fortnightly and the audience is growing again. So I think that's evidence that the more episodes you do, hopefully the faster you'll grow an audience. The issue I have with monthly is when in the month do you release? If you're trying to have that regularity for listeners, weekly makes sense. Every Tuesday, every Thursday, whatever it is, it's simple. Fortnightly the same, every second Tuesday or every second Friday. But once you go to monthly, is it the day of the month? But if you choose the 15th, that might be a Sunday. So then you might say, okay, the last Tuesday of the month. When people get a podcast weekly, they know it's every week. If it's fortnightly, it almost feels like weekly because a fortnight goes so fast. So a fortnightly podcast is almost like the cheats version of a weekly, I find. It almost feels like it's a weekly even though it's fortnightly. Once you go to monthly, it almost feels random.
Absolutely. And I think we have short memories. We're so busy. We're exposed to so much that we forget. So in order to be top of mind, that idea of being weekly or fortnightly is a much better opportunity to stick in your audience's mind as well.
And if you can do daily, do daily.
Go for it. Do daily. Okay, question 3. In what style or format should a podcast be?
There are so many different styles and formats. And I think this is where, big picture, don't just copy the podcast that you last heard or the podcast that's doing well in the charts. I do encourage people to think about different ways of providing entertainment via audio. Having said that, let's drill down to some of the more simple formats, like a simple interview format, very popular in podcasting. Conversation between two people, like we're having now, works really well in podcasting, quite simple to produce, just a straight interview.
And then you have the narrative style of podcasting, Nick.
Yeah, so by narrative, that's more of a documentary style where you have a scripted host and perhaps several voices. It could be 2, 3, 4, 5 voices mixed throughout the episode with the scripted host tying it all together. Obviously a higher level of complexity in the production process, but if done well, can be a really, really rich storytelling style.
It is my favourite style of podcast, I have to say. It offers you a much deeper experience. It's far richer, as you say, and entertainment value is a lot higher. So it's an interesting and exciting style of podcasting.
Yeah, absolutely. And the middle ground between those two is sort of an interview narrative style where it's still a single interview, but you use scripting of the host to just increase the pace a little bit, makes it feel a bit more polished and professional, perhaps. We're assuming here that most of this is for non-fiction podcasts.
Yes.
Of course, in the fiction genre, well, the sky's the limit in the way you can tell stories and have fun and characters and immersive sound and a whole lot of other things.
And of course, there are legendary branded podcasts that have gone into the fictional space, like GE, who did The Message, an award-winning podcast. It can be a leap to go from traditional interview or even traditional narrative for brands, but it's such an incredibly engrossing experience for the listener that in terms of awareness and affinity for the brand, it can just yield incredible results. Okay, question 4. What's the best way to record a podcast?
Well, we always aim for the highest quality, which means wherever possible, we like to record in a studio. For 3 decades, we've always had our own in-house studio, which makes that quite easy for us. But we also, for interstate guests, will normally link to a studio, perhaps an ABC studio or another private studio, because we aim for broadcast quality from the outset. We think that is the best way of respecting the listener who's taken the time to tune into a podcast, to deliver them the very best quality audio we can. But you don't have to record everything in a studio, and we certainly don't. We quite often will record on location. And recording on location in some circumstances works better because perhaps the guest will be more comfortable, maybe a farmer on his farm, and there might be ambient noise of cows in the background, that sort of thing. Location recording can be very effective when used correctly. And of course, during COVID, we've been doing 90% of our recording remotely.
Yeah, we sure have.
At times, 100%, where we literally cannot leave our homes.
Yeah.
And there are some great software options like Zencaster or Squadcast. We use Source Connect for capturing high-quality audio over the internet. There are some tips and tricks, and it does take a little bit of skill to do that, but there's definitely options to do that, and you can still get a great result that way.
Okay, Nick, now, question 5. What should you keep in mind when developing a brand for the podcast?
There are really 2 main elements when it comes down to the visual branding of a podcast, and that's the name and the artwork. And they are both equally important and very, very important in being discovered, capturing the attention of your listeners. So the name first, we recommend keeping it as short as possible, 1 to 3 or 4 words. And this is really because it's got to fit onto artwork that quite often is about the size of a postage stamp.
Yeah.
So the less words, the more it's going to stand out and the easier it's going to be to read. You can add taglines that help describe what the name is. They might not work on the artwork itself, but at least you can use them in podcast apps as a bit of an explainer. But the name should be clear as to what the listener's going to get. So don't try and be too clever by half. You see some names that are quite ambiguous. When you work out what the podcast is about, it might be quite clever, but you've lost an opportunity there of perhaps getting a potential listener to click on your podcast and tune in because they've missed the point, they've missed the joke, they haven't got it. So I think clear and concise, and try and be as creative as possible within those bounds. When it comes to the artwork, you're probably better to talk about artwork because you're the digital marketer.
I think similar to what you were saying, try not to be too clever, but there is an opportunity to be creative. So Apple do recommend light and bright, especially if at night, if people are flicking through their podcast apps, you don't want to be too dark and be missed. You're in and amongst artwork from many, many other podcasts, so you need to try and find a way to stand out as best as you can.
Yeah, I think high contrast colours, keeping in mind, again, it's going to be very small in some settings, so don't go for really detailed images that are going to get lost when it's shrunk down. Keep it simple, keep it bold. Another way to get ideas on what's good and maybe what's not so good is to look at the top 100 chart on whatever your favourite podcast app is and see the artwork that really pops off the screen at you.
Now, question 6. How do you get a podcast into Apple and Spotify? We get this a lot as well.
Yeah, so some people don't realise that Apple don't host any audio.
Yeah.
They're just a directory, as are Spotify, Google Podcasts, and all the other smaller apps out there, Pocket Casts, Overcast. So what you need to do is host the audio somewhere. Now, 15 years ago when we first started publishing podcasts, you needed to have an IT degree to work out how to host the podcast and create the metadata and all that, because podcasts are distributed by an RSS feed. Luckily today, there are many hosting platforms out there. The one we recommend to our clients is Omni Studio. They're here in Australia, a great team. We've had the managing director, Sharon Taylor, on this show a number of times. They're just easy to talk to, great tech, and it always works. So if you're looking for a platform, we highly recommend that one. But there are many others, both here in Australia and around the world, that fundamentally do a similar thing. I describe it as them being a little bit like the YouTube for audio. You upload your audio, your metadata, your title, your descriptions, your artwork. And the most important thing they do, these platforms, is create that RSS feed for you. Once you have that RSS feed, you then submit that to Apple, Spotify, etc. And that's how your podcast ends up in those directories. It's important to keep in mind that with Apple, and they are the biggest podcast app still, being chased down by Spotify, but they have the biggest audience still. They need to approve your podcast before it will appear. And that can take, they say, up to a week, normally a few days, but make sure you submit that podcast to Apple in advance of when you want to launch. Many other podcast apps use the Apple index. So Pocket Cast, Overcast, those kind of apps will automatically index your podcast once it's in the Apple podcast directory. And the other great thing about the hosting platforms is they then provide analytics about who's listening, where they're listening, how much they're listening, those sorts of things. And very importantly, they offer an embeddable player.
Yes.
It's really important that you embed that player on your website or on a website that you create for your podcast. And that becomes a central place for your podcast. In all your marketing and your social media and your promotion, that's where you send people first so they can click one button and listen. And then, of course, if they already use an app like Apple or Spotify, then you have the link there so they can subscribe and keep listening through their preferred listening platform.
Yes. Now, Nick, the podcast is up on Apple, Spotify, all the big publishers. How many downloads should a podcast expect?
It's surprising how often this question is asked after the podcast has been launched.
So true.
We try and set expectations back at the strategy phase of producing a podcast. That's where we set the expectations, and it really does depend on who your audience is, how big that audience is. You might have a very niche podcast. We produce podcasts for associations, so they have a finite number of members that they're trying to target. So for them, if they get 10, 15% of that audience, if they have 10,000 members and they're getting 1,000 listening, then they're quite happy with that. But if you are expecting tens of thousands of downloads, then you better make sure that you've got a way of reaching hundreds of thousands of potential listeners to get those downloads. I often refer to some stats on what the averages are for other podcasts to kind of put it into perspective. Some stats from March 2020 from Libsyn, which is another very large hosting platform. They host more than 50,000 podcasts, so there's a decent base here for these stats. After 30 days from release of an episode, if you get 136 downloads, you're actually in the top 50% of podcasts in the world. To be in the top 20% of podcasts, you need 1,100 downloads. If you're getting more than 3,200 downloads, you're in the top 10%. 7,700 downloads, you're in the top 5%. More than 20,000 downloads, you're in the top 2%. And if you want to be in that top 1% of podcasts, it's 36,000 downloads. So you can see that the numbers are quite small, right up there until 3,000 downloads for the top 10% is not a huge number as a raw number. But again, it all depends on how many people you're actually targeting.
That's exactly right. So for people or for brands that are just starting out, I wouldn't get despondent about starting with low numbers, low downloads. This is the point from where you build. And again, it depends on how you promote, how you market and get the word out. Yeah,
and podcasting has a long tail. If it's evergreen content, stuff that you release today or tomorrow or next week or next month might still be relevant in years from now. And so those numbers will continue to increase. It'll be searchable by Google and all those sorts of things. So those numbers will go up over time.
That's exactly right. And in fact, leads perfectly into question 8, which is, how do I grow my audience?
Well, I'm going to throw to you, Nicole, again, because you are the digital marketing expert in our team. Before I do, though, let me just say there's one thing that we say to our clients, and that is, when you get to the point of having finished producing that podcast, you've got the MP3 in your hot little hand, that's about 50% of the job. Don't think that you just got to upload it and suddenly the audience will appear, because they won't. You still need to do a lot of marketing and amplification and tell people about your podcast. But what are the best ways to do it? You tell me.
You're very right, Nick. It's almost like the second phase of work begins. But that's also why we talk about marketing upfront in our strategy session too. The earlier that you can nut out what the marketing might be upfront, the less pain there is on the back end from when you press publish. But you want to look at your owned media. So absolutely your website or a specific website for the podcast. That's where you want to direct all traffic. And then what else do you own? Your social media pages, your newsletter, if you have events, whatever you own as a brand, use it to its fullest potential. Post as often as you can, but always direct back to the website for people to listen. So partnerships are another great way to build awareness for your podcast. Think about quid pro quos, how you can benefit from their audience reach and how they can benefit from yours. What you're really trying to do in these instances is broaden your reach as much as possible. PR, sending media releases to as many potentially interested publishers as you can. You never know who'll be interested and write a great article about your podcast. And then paid opportunities obviously is boosting your posts on social media and, of course, ads and other podcasts. You can also collaborate with different podcasts. This is probably one of the best ways to promote your own podcast. If you can go on to another podcast that is similar to yours, have that host promote and talk to you, perhaps on the podcast, and then you do the same with them. It's that collaborative piece. A brilliant, brilliant way to promote your podcast. So there are plenty of opportunities to promote. It's just about thinking outside the square a little bit and planning. Plan.
I always like to think about the two distinct audiences for your podcast when it comes to amplification. Those who already listen to podcasts and those who don't necessarily already listen to podcasts. And like you were saying, ads in podcasts, it's easy to find people that already listen because we know where they are. So those ones are pretty straightforward. But for those who don't listen, that's where you've got to get a little bit more traditional with your marketing. There's almost an education piece involved there because you're not only trying to tell them to listen to your podcast, but you might have to almost explain to them what a podcast is.
Yeah.
But what a great opportunity for your podcast to be the first podcast that person's ever listened to, because you're not competing then for share of their 5 hours of podcast listening time a week. They're going to be like, oh, wow, not only do I love this podcast, but now they may have fallen in love with podcasts, and they'll probably thank you for that as well.
Exactly.
But for non-podcast listeners, that's why the website is really important too. We know that up to about 30% of people in some cases from the analytics that we see will listen to the embedded player on a website. And I would assume the majority of those people are people that don't already have a podcast app. They've been sent an email or they've seen your social media post or something like that and they've just clicked it and they've ended up on your website and they've hit the play button straight away. So it's really important to have that central place to send everybody.
At all times, your website should be the one central source of truth, always. Okay, Nick, we're getting close to the end. Question 9. What ROI can a brand expect from their podcast?
Well, I like to flip that question back a different way. What's the opportunity cost of not having an audio strategy or a podcast?
Ooh.
With podcasts being such a fast-growing medium for communication and with listenership increasing year on year, while, mind you, use of some social media platforms like Facebook is actually going down, you would be crazy to not at least consider having a podcast in your content marketing mix. That's if you're a big brand. We talk about the benefits a lot on this podcast, so I'm not going to go through it in great detail, but the bigger picture is it's quite intangible in many ways. So if you are thinking of doing a podcast because you want to sell X more widgets, not the right way to be going about it. But what you will get with podcasts is greater awareness of your brand, the thought leadership potential, your ability to really own a space where you're an expert, a really rare opportunity to have long-form conversations with your customers and prospects, which you can't have on video or through blogs where you might only have minutes or seconds of people skimming through things. The opportunity to humanise a brand is really big. The value add that you offer by providing entertainment to your customers that you will then be thanked for, all the while you're building that trust and loyalty from the people listening who will appreciate the fact that you've gone to the effort to produce this entertainment or this information for them. We know that unaided branded recall from podcasts is 75, 80%, which is huge. And at last count, at least 7.5 million Australians who have listened to a podcast. That is a huge and growing audience who are seeing the benefits in listening. Those benefits we've talked about before. You can multitask, you can listen to audio in time that's otherwise wasted, like in the car or going for a run or a walk. But I guess you've got to remember that all these things, like I said, are somewhat intangible.
And podcasting, like any new technology, is something that people are latching onto and in particular are loving. They're being entertained and it's where people are in growing numbers. So ad agencies, communications agencies, they are trying to fulfill 360-degree communication strategies to their clients by including podcasting like they did back in the day with online ads, digital ads, websites, blogs. Now it's podcasting.
It's the new shiny thing, but it's more than that though, isn't it?
100%. I think there's longevity in podcasting. There's opportunities to grow affinity, awareness, loyalty. It's also an opportunity to surprise and delight for your audiences who might think you're a stuffy brand and stuck in TV land or radio, and all of a sudden you pop up with a podcast, a great entertaining podcast. Amazing. So the way that they look at you can change. The way that they interact with you will change. There's a lot to benefit from podcast ROI, and it should never be done in isolation. It should always be done with that 360-degree marketing communication strategy.
Spoken like a true marketer.
And on that note, let's finish off with question 10.
We made it.
We made it. But don't answer it, Nick, because this question is for you. Yes, you listening right now. There are so many questions that we could have answered, but we would love to hear from you. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask us, please, we'd be more than happy to talk to you and help wherever we can.
Yes, Nicole, I'm sure we have missed some burning questions that our listeners have, so please do make contact and we can have a chat. But that is all we have time for on this episode of Podcasting Essentials. Thanks, Nicole, for joining me as always.
No problem, Nick. That was fun. That was great.
To find out more about how we can help you create a podcast, check out our website at soundcartel.com.au or on the socials at SoundCartelAU. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're after business insights and inspiration each morning, check out our daily podcast, Business Essentials Daily, wherever you're listening now. From all of us at SoundCartel, thanks so much for listening.